There comes a point in some unhealthy relationships when something inside you changes. You stop arguing. You stop explaining yourself. You stop trying to convince the other person to understand what they did to you. You stop checking whether they are angry, happy, distant, or suddenly affectionate. And perhaps most importantly, you stop caring in the way you used to care. This does not necessarily mean that you have become cold or heartless. It may simply mean that you have become exhausted from investing emotional energy into a dynamic that repeatedly left you confused, criticized, dismissed, or emotionally drained. When that shift happens, the relationship dynamic can change dramatically. The person who once received your attention may suddenly notice that your attention is no longer available in the same way. And this is where it becomes important to understand one of the most difficult patterns associated with narcissistic behavior. When emotional access begins to disappear, attempts may be made to regain it. Sometimes those attempts are obvious. Sometimes they are subtle. And sometimes they look remarkably similar to love, regret, concern, or even vulnerability. The important thing is not to become obsessed with determining exactly what another person is thinking. The important thing is learning to recognize patterns and protect your emotional boundaries. One of the most common ways an unhealthy dynamic can attempt to pull you back in is through emotional provocation. Think about what used to happen when you were deeply invested. Perhaps an accusation could immediately make you defend yourself. A criticism could make you explain yourself for an hour. A period of silence could make you panic and reach out. A social media post could make you wonder who they were trying to impress. A sudden accusation could make you desperately prove that you were not the person they claimed you were. When your emotional reactions become predictable, the relationship can develop a pattern where one person's behavior consistently produces a strong response from the other. But when you stop participating, the old pattern no longer works as effectively. This is why the final trick is often not some elaborate scheme. Sometimes it is simply an attempt to make you feel something again: anger, jealousy, guilt, fear, curiosity, confusion. Anything that gets your emotional attention back on the person. And this is an important distinction. Attention is not the same thing as love, and emotional intensity is not the same thing as intimacy. You may have experienced this yourself. The moment you finally begin moving forward, something happens. Maybe there is suddenly a message after weeks of silence. Maybe they suddenly remember the good times. Maybe they tell you that nobody understands them like you did. Maybe they apologize, but the apology somehow turns into a discussion about everything you supposedly did wrong. Maybe they become unusually affectionate. Maybe they tell you they have changed. Or perhaps they suddenly become angry because you are no longer responding the way you once did. These behaviors can be confusing because they can activate the part of you that still hopes for closure. You may think, maybe this time they finally understand. You may wonder whether the person you wanted them to become is finally appearing. But this is where emotional awareness becomes essential. Instead of asking, "What does this mean?" ask, "What pattern am I seeing? Is there sustained accountability? Are they taking responsibility without blaming you? Are their actions consistent over time? Are your boundaries being respected? Are they willing to accept your decision even when they do not like it?" These questions tell you much more than dramatic words ever could. Another behavior that deserves careful attention is what is often called hoovering. The term describes attempts to pull someone back into a relationship or interaction after distance has developed. Hoovering can take many forms. It can look like affection, nostalgia, apologies, promises, compliments, anger, guilt, or even a sudden crisis. Not every attempt to reconnect is necessarily manipulative, and not every apology is dishonest. Human beings can genuinely regret their actions and change. But genuine change has characteristics that can be observed. It does not depend solely on emotional speeches. It appears through consistent behavior. A person who has genuinely taken responsibility does not simply say, "I am sorry." They demonstrate that understanding through changed behavior. Respect for boundaries, willingness to hear difficult feedback, and acceptance that trust may take time to rebuild. If someone becomes angry because you need distance, that is important information. If someone demands immediate forgiveness because they apologized, that is important information. If someone repeatedly promises change, but returns to the same behavior once they feel secure again, that is also important information. The reason these patterns can be so difficult to recognize is that you are not responding only to the present moment. You are often responding to the entire history of the relationship. Your first nervous system remembers the periods of affection, rejection, confusion, hope, disappointment, and reconciliation. That history can create a powerful emotional pull. When someone suddenly becomes loving after being hurtful, the contrast can feel enormous. You may experience relief. You may feel hopeful. You may remember the beginning of the relationship and think, maybe that person is still in there. But this is where you need to separate potential from reality. Almost anyone can behave well for a short period. The real question is whether the healthier behavior continues when there is no immediate reward for it. Does respect remain when you say no? Does accountability remain when you disagree? Does empathy remain when they are frustrated? Does kindness remain when you are not giving them what they want? Consistency is one of the most reliable indicators of meaningful change. When you genuinely stop caring about getting a particular reaction from someone, something powerful begins to happen inside you. You stop monitoring them. You stop wondering whether they are thinking about you. You stop trying to make them realize what they lost. You stop constructing your healing around the possibility that they will regret hurting you. This is an important psychological shift because healing can become another form of emotional attachment if your entire recovery depends on the other person eventually suffering apologizing, or recognizing your value. You may be physically distant, but emotionally still connected because you are waiting for a reaction. True emotional freedom goes deeper. It means you no longer need their regret to validate your pain. You no longer need their apology to confirm that what happened mattered. You no longer need them to admit what they did before you are allowed to move forward. This is also why silence should not be treated as a weapon. Healthy disengagement is not about punishing someone by withholding attention. It is about recognizing when a conversation is no longer productive and choosing not to participate in repetitive conflict. There is a major difference between silent treatment used to control someone and healthy distance used to protect yourself. One is intended to create emotional distress. The other is intended to create emotional space. You do not need to announce your independence every day. You do not need to prove that you are stronger. You do not need to post messages designed to make someone jealous. You do not need to demonstrate that you are happier without them. The more your healing depends on them noticing your healing, the more emotional power they still have over you. And this is where many people misunderstand what happens when they stop caring. They imagine that the goal is to make the other person panic. They want to know whether the narcissistic person is suffering, whether they miss them, whether they are obsessed, or whether they are secretly watching from a distance. But if your entire focus remains on those questions, you have not completely left the emotional dynamic. You may have stopped speaking to the person, but mentally, you are still having conversations with them. You are still imagining their reactions. You are still measuring your progress against their response. That is why the deepest form of freedom is not making someone else feel powerless. It is becoming less interested in whether they feel powerful or powerless at all. You may also discover that when you stop reacting, people sometimes try different approaches. If anger no longer works, they may try kindness. If kindness does not work, they may try guilt. If guilt does not work, they may try accusations. If accusations do not work, they may suddenly become vulnerable. Again, the point is not to assume that every behavior has a hidden manipulative intention. The point is to look at the overall pattern. Does the interaction consistently leave you feeling responsible for their emotions? Do you repeatedly find yourself defending your character? Are your boundaries treated as personal attacks? Are you pressured to provide emotional access that you no longer want to provide? If so, you have valuable information. You do not have to diagnose the other person to recognize that a relationship dynamic is unhealthy for you. One of the hardest lessons is learning that you can care about someone's humanity while still refusing to participate in their behavior. You can wish someone well and still maintain distance. You can recognize that someone may have their own wounds without making yourself responsible for healing them. You can understand that a person's behavior may come from insecurity, shame, fear, or emotional manipulations without excusing the harm that behavior causes. Understanding is not the same as tolerating. Compassion is not the same as access. Forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. And closure does not always come from a final conversation. Sometimes closure comes from accepting that the conversation you desperately wanted may never happen. If you are waiting for the perfect apology, you may remain emotionally connected for a very long time. If you are waiting for the person to finally admit everything, you may give them years of space inside your mind. If you are waiting for them to understand your worth, you are still allowing their perception to determine your worth. Your value existed before their approval, and it remains after their rejection. You do not become valuable because someone finally recognizes you. You become free when you stop requiring recognition from someone who repeatedly failed to appreciate what you brought into the relationship. There is another important lesson here. Do not mistake emotional withdrawal for emotional healing. You can stop responding and still be deeply wounded. You can block someone and still think about them every morning. You can move away and still replay old conversations. You can look calm on the outside while internally you are still waiting for justice. Healing requires more than distance. It requires rebuilding your relationship with yourself. It means learning to trust your perceptions again. It means recognizing the difference between responsibility and guilt. It means becoming comfortable with boundaries. It means allowing yourself to experience emotions without automatically acting on them. It means understanding that discomfort does not mean you made the wrong decision. Sometimes the most significant moment in your recovery is not when the other person changes. It is when you realize that you no longer need them to change. You stop asking, "How can I make them understand?" and begin asking, "What do I need to understand?" You stop asking, "Why did they treat me this way?" and begin asking, "Why did I feel that I had to keep accepting it?" You stop asking, "Will they come back?" and begin asking, "If they do, what boundaries will I have?" Those questions move your attention away from controlling another person and toward understanding yourself. The final dirty trick, if there is one worth being aware of, is the temptation to make your healing about winning. You may feel that you need to become more successful, happier, more attractive, more accomplished, or more emotionally detached so that the other person regrets losing you. But that still keeps them at the center of your life. You do not need to become extraordinary to prove that leaving was justified. You do not need to make them jealous. You do not need to make them regret anything. Your life is not a performance designed for an audience of one person who hurt you. Your healing belongs to you. Eventually, the greatest shift happens when their behavior becomes information rather than instruction. If they are angry, you do not automatically have to fix it. If they are disappointed, you do not automatically have to apologize. If they accuse you, you do not automatically have to defend yourself. If they praise you, you do not automatically have to reopen the door. If they suddenly become affectionate, You do not automatically have to believe the promise. You can pause. You can observe. You can ask yourself what is healthy for you. That pause is powerful because it gives you something the unhealthy dynamic may have taken away. Choice. And perhaps that is the real meaning of stopping caring. It does not mean you stop being compassionate. It does not mean you stop having emotions. It does not mean you become bitter. It means you stop allowing another person's behavior to control your emotional weather. You can feel sadness without returning. You can feel anger without retaliating. You can remember the good without forgetting the bad. You can miss someone and still know that contact is unhealthy. You can love someone and still choose yourself. These are not contradictions. They are signs of emotional maturity. So if you find yourself at the point where you genuinely no longer want to participate in the cycle, protect that realization. Do not turn your freedom into another strategy for getting a reaction. Do not monitor their social media looking for evidence that they are suffering. Do not ask mutual friends what they are saying about you. Do not create situations designed to make them jealous. Every one of those behaviors can quietly reconnect you to the same emotional system you worked so hard to leave. Instead, bring your attention back to your own life, your sleep, your friendships, your goals, your confidence, your routines, your peace, your ability to make decisions without anticipating someone else's reaction. Because the goal was never to become better at manipulating the manipulator. The goal was to stop living inside the manipulation altogether. The goal was never to make them feel what they made you feel. The goal was to become someone who no longer needs their pain to justify your healing. And when you reach that point, something changes. Their anger becomes theirs. Their disappointment becomes theirs. Their narrative becomes theirs. Their attempts to provoke you become choices you are no longer obligated to answer. You begin to understand that boundaries do not require permission, and peace does not require agreement. You may never know what someone thinks when you stop responding. You may never know whether they regret what happened. You may never know whether they miss you. And eventually, you may realize that you do not need to know. That is the freedom. Not knowing stops being torture because their inner world is no longer your responsibility. You are no longer waiting for a final confession, a perfect apology, or a dramatic realization. You are simply moving forward. And moving forward does not mean you forgot what happened. It means what happened no longer gets to decide what happens next. So if you have reached the point where you no longer want to chase, explain, defend, convince, or prove yourself, understand that this can be a meaningful turning point. Protect it with boundaries. Protect it with consistency. Protect it by refusing to confuse intensity with love and promises with change. And most importantly, protect it by remembering that your healing is not measured by how strongly someone reacts to losing access to you. Your healing is measured by how peacefully you can live without needing their reactions at all. When you finally stop caring about whether they understand your value, whether they regret losing you, or whether they are watching from a distance, you have taken your attention back. And sometimes taking your attention back is one of the most powerful steps you can take toward rebuilding your life. There comes a point in an unhealthy relationship when something inside you quietly changes. You may not even notice the exact moment it happens. One day, you simply realize that you are tired of explaining yourself, tired of defending your intentions, tired of trying to prove that your feelings are valid, and tired of waiting for someone else to finally understand what their behavior has been doing to you. You stop checking your phone every few minutes. You stop wondering whether they are angry. You stop trying to predict their next move. You stop changing your behavior simply to keep the peace. Most importantly, you stop giving their reactions the same emotional importance they once had. This shift can be especially significant in relationships characterized by manipulation, emotional inconsistency, or narcissistic traits, because the relationship may have become organized around one person's ability to obtain attention, reassurance, validation, or emotional reactions from the other. When you withdraw from that cycle, the familiar pattern can become disrupted. It is important, however, not to assume that every reaction from another person is automatically calculated or malicious. Human behavior is complicated. What matters is whether there is a repeated pattern in which your boundaries are challenged whenever you become less emotionally available. Sometimes the response may be increased affection, sudden apologies, dramatic promises, accusations, jealousy-provoking behavior, or attempts to make you feel guilty for creating distance. The common factor is that the interaction may be trying to pull your attention back toward the relationship. This is why recognizing your own emotional response is so important. Instead of immediately reacting, pause and ask yourself what is happening inside you. Are you suddenly feeling responsible for their emotions? Are you experiencing guilt because you said no? Are you tempted to explain yourself again? Are you hoping that this new behavior means everything has finally changed? These questions help you step outside the emotional storm and observe the pattern more clearly. Stopping the cycle does not mean becoming cruel or emotionless. It means realizing that you are allowed to stop participating in interactions that repeatedly undermine your peace, and that your attention is something you have the right to choose where to place. One of the most powerful ways an unhealthy relationship dynamic can pull you back in is by provoking an emotional reaction. When you have finally stopped arguing, stopped explaining, and stopped chasing, the interaction may suddenly become intense again. You might receive a message designed to make you angry, a comment intended to make you jealous, an accusation that makes you feel the need to defend yourself, or a statement that creates doubt about everything you have experienced. The important thing is not to assume that every provocative action is consciously planned. Instead, pay attention to the pattern and to what the interaction consistently produces in you. If every conversation leaves you anxious, defensive, guilty, confused, or desperate to prove yourself, that emotional response deserves attention. Emotional provocation can be particularly powerful because it gives you the illusion that you must respond immediately. You may think, I need to correct this. They cannot believe that about me. Or, I have to explain what really happened. But sometimes the need to defend yourself becomes the doorway back into the same exhausting cycle. You do not have to answer every accusation, correct every misunderstanding, or convince someone who has already decided what they want to believe. A boundary can be as simple as refusing to participate in an argument that has no productive purpose. This does not mean suppressing your emotions. You can feel angry without sending the message. You can feel hurt without reopening the conversation. You can feel tempted to respond and still choose to pause. That pause gives your thinking brain an opportunity to catch up with your emotional reaction. Over time, you begin to recognize that peace does not come from winning every argument. It comes from becoming selective about which interactions deserve your energy. When someone can no longer control your behavior through anger, guilt, jealousy, or confusion, you begin to reclaim something that is far more valuable than proving yourself right: your emotional freedom. Another pattern that can be confusing after you begin creating distance is what is often called hoovering, a term used to describe attempts to pull someone back into an old relationship dynamic. It can happen after a breakup, a period of no contact, or simply after you stop providing the attention and emotional availability you once provided. Hoovering does not always look aggressive or manipulative on the surface. Sometimes it can look incredibly loving. You may suddenly receive an apology, a message saying they miss you, a reminder of a special memory, a promise that everything will be different, or an emotional confession about how much they have changed. In other situations, the approach may involve guilt, accusations, jealousy, anger, or even a sudden personal crisis that makes you feel responsible for responding. This is why it can be so difficult to recognize. The behavior may activate the part of you that still remembers the good moments and hopes that the person you loved is finally ready to become the person you needed them to be. But there is an important distinction between genuine change and temporary behavior designed to restore an old dynamic. Genuine change is demonstrated through consistency. Someone who has truly taken responsibility does not simply say the right words when they fear losing access to you. They gradually demonstrate different behavior even when there is no immediate reward. They respect your boundaries. They accept that you may not trust them immediately. They do not pressure you to forgive them on their timetable. They can acknowledge the harm they caused without immediately turning the conversation into an attack against you. Most importantly, they understand that an apology does not create an obligation for you to return. This is where you have to become careful with hope. Hope is not weakness, and there is nothing wrong with wanting people to change. But hope becomes dangerous when it repeatedly overrides evidence. If someone has promised change many times and the same pattern keeps returning, pay attention to the pattern rather than the promise. You do not have to decide whether the other person is secretly manipulating you. You only have to decide whether the behavior is healthy enough for you to participate in. A sudden apology can be appreciated without being accepted as proof of transformation. A loving message can be acknowledged without reopening the relationship. Even genuine remorse does not automatically erase the consequences of repeated behavior. Your responsibility is not to determine whether someone deserves another chance. Your responsibility is to protect your emotional well-being and make decisions based on consistent evidence. When you understand this, you become less vulnerable to emotional confusion. You stop asking whether a dramatic moment means everything has changed and start asking whether the person's behavior has actually changed over time. That shift in perspective can protect you from being pulled back into a cycle that you worked very hard to leave. There is a profound psychological shift that can happen when you stop reacting to someone who has become accustomed to receiving your attention, explanations, emotional energy, or reassurance. Your silence may not actually be about punishing them. It may simply be the result of realizing that continuing the same conversations is no longer helping you. You may have reached the point where you understand that arguing will not create accountability. Explaining yourself one more time will not suddenly produce empathy, and proving your innocence will not necessarily change someone else's interpretation of events. When you stop participating in those repetitive exchanges, you create space between what another person does and what you choose to do about it. That space is extremely important because emotional control often becomes stronger when there is no pause between a trigger and a reaction. Someone says something hurtful and you immediately defend yourself. Someone withdraws affection and you immediately chase them. Someone becomes angry and you immediately try to calm them down. Someone accuses you of something and you immediately begin explaining every detail. Over time, this can become an automatic pattern. You are no longer consciously choosing your response. You are reacting because the relationship has trained you to anticipate emotional consequences. When you begin breaking that pattern, your silence can feel powerful because you are no longer giving every emotional trigger an immediate response. You might still feel angry, anxious, sad, or tempted to respond, but you give yourself permission to pause. That pause is not weakness. It is emotional regulation. You are teaching yourself that you can experience an uncomfortable feeling without immediately acting on it. You can allow someone to be disappointed without rushing to make them happy. You can allow someone to misunderstand you without spending hours trying to correct their perception. You can allow an accusation to exist without accepting it as truth. This is especially important in relationships where you have become accustomed to carrying responsibility for another person's emotional state. You may have spent so much time asking, "How do I make them calm?" that you forgot to ask, "What do I need to feel safe and emotionally stable?" However, silence should not be confused with the silent treatment. The silent treatment is often used as a punishment or a method of creating anxiety and forcing another person to chase. Healthy distance has a completely different purpose. It is about protecting your peace and refusing to continue an interaction that is harmful or unproductive. You are not trying to make someone suffer. You are simply deciding that you do not have to participate. This distinction matters because healing should not become another form of control. If you stop responding only because you want the other person to panic, wonder about you, or come running back, then your attention is still centered on their reaction. True emotional freedom develops when you stop measuring your boundaries by what they make the other person feel. You may notice that this is easier said than done. Your mind may still ask what they are thinking. You may wonder whether they noticed your silence. You may imagine whether they are angry or regretful. These thoughts are normal, especially after an emotionally intense relationship. The goal is not to force yourself never to think about the person again. The goal is to notice the thought without allowing it to control your next action. Every time you resist the urge to check, chase, explain, or react, you strengthen your ability to choose rather than automatically respond. Eventually, your silence becomes less about them and more about you. It becomes the space where you rediscover your own judgment, your own priorities, and your own emotional stability. You begin to understand that you do not need to be heard by everyone to know what you experienced. You do not need another person's agreement to establish a boundary. And you do not need to keep explaining your decision simply because someone refuses to accept it. Your attention is yours. Your emotional energy is yours. And learning to decide where those resources go is one of the most important steps toward genuine freedom. One of the most important lessons to understand when dealing with unhealthy relationship dynamics is that emotional intensity should never automatically be interpreted as proof of love. When someone suddenly becomes extremely emotional after you create distance, it can be tempting to believe that their reaction proves how deeply they care about you. They may become desperate, angry, tearful, affectionate, apologetic, or unusually attentive. And you may think, finally, they understand what I mean to them. But strong emotion by itself does not tell you what caused that emotion. A person can feel distressed because they genuinely regret hurting someone, but they can also feel distressed because they are losing control of a situation, losing access to another person, facing rejection, or confronting consequences they previously avoided. From the outside, these reactions can look very similar. That is why it is so important to focus less on the intensity of the moment and more on the pattern of behavior that follows it. Real accountability is rarely demonstrated by one dramatic conversation. It is demonstrated repeatedly, especially when the person is uncomfortable. Someone who has genuinely recognized their harmful behavior will usually show a willingness to listen, accept responsibility, and respect the other person's boundaries. They will not require immediate forgiveness simply because they apologized. They will understand that trust cannot be demanded. It has to be rebuilt through consistent actions. They may also accept that the other person has the right to decide whether reconciliation is appropriate. This is an important distinction because manipulation can sometimes involve enormous emotional displays that create pressure for immediate forgiveness. You may hear statements such as, "I can't live without you," "You're the only person who understands me," or "I'll do anything to get you back." Those statements may sound deeply romantic, but they do not necessarily answer the most important question. Has the behavior actually changed? When you are emotionally attached to someone, dramatic moments can have enormous psychological power. Your brain remembers the good periods of the relationship, the affection, the promises, the memories, and the moments when you believed everything could work. When the person suddenly becomes loving again, those memories can become activated. You may begin imagining the relationship you wanted rather than evaluating the relationship you actually experienced. This is why it can be helpful to slow everything down. Instead of asking, "Do they still love me?" ask, "Do I feel respected around them?" Instead of asking, "Are they finally sorry?" ask, "Do they consistently take responsibility?" Instead of asking, "Why are they so emotional?" ask, "What happens after the emotion disappears?" These questions bring you back to observable behavior rather than speculation. Another important warning sign is when someone's emotional reaction becomes a reason for you to abandon your boundaries. Perhaps you said that you need space, and they respond by saying that you are cruel. Perhaps you ended a conversation because it became disrespectful, and they accuse you of abandoning them. Perhaps you decided that you do not want to continue the relationship, and they tell you that your decision proves you never loved them. These statements can create tremendous guilt because they make your boundary appear to be the cause of their suffering. But another person's emotional response to your boundary does not automatically mean that the boundary is wrong. Healthy relationships require people to tolerate disappointment. If someone cannot accept no without attempting to punish, pressure, shame, or manipulate you, that tells you something important about the relationship dynamic. This is also why you should be cautious about confusing jealousy with love. Someone becoming jealous when you move forward may demonstrate that they do not want to lose access to you, but jealousy itself is not proof of healthy attachment. Love is not measured by how intensely someone reacts when you become unavailable. Healthy love is reflected in respect, trust, emotional safety, consideration, and the ability to support another person's autonomy. A person can deeply want someone and still treat that person poorly. Desire and healthy love are not interchangeable. You also do not have to become cynical to protect yourself. Not every apology is fake. Not every emotional reaction is manipulation. Not every person who comes back after a breakup is trying to control you. The goal is not to assume the worst. The goal is to stop allowing words or emotional displays to override evidence. You can remain compassionate while being discerning. You can acknowledge someone's feelings without taking responsibility for regulating them. You can appreciate an apology without deciding that reconciliation is necessary. You can believe that someone may be capable of change while recognizing that you are not required to wait around to see whether they actually change. Ultimately, the question is not whether someone is devastated by losing you. The question is whether the relationship is capable of becoming healthy. If the same disrespect, blame, dishonesty, emotional volatility, or boundary violations continue after the dramatic moment passes, then the intensity of that moment has little value as evidence of transformation. Real change becomes visible in ordinary moments. When there is disagreement, when someone hears no, when they feel criticized, when they are disappointed, when they do not get what they want, and when nobody is watching. That is where character becomes visible. So if someone suddenly becomes extremely emotional because you have stopped caring, resist the temptation to measure your worth by their reaction. Their intensity does not determine your value. Their regret does not validate your pain. Their desire to get you back does not automatically mean they have become capable of giving you the relationship you deserved. Let behavior, consistency, accountability, and respect speak louder than emotional fireworks. When you learn to do that, you become much harder to pull back into a cycle simply because someone suddenly becomes intense. You begin choosing based on reality rather than hope, and that is one of the clearest signs that your emotional freedom is becoming stronger. The deepest form of freedom after an unhealthy relationship is not making the other person regret losing you. And it is not watching them struggle because you finally stopped giving them attention. Real freedom is reaching a place where their reaction is no longer the measure of your healing. When you have been emotionally invested in someone who repeatedly criticized you, confused you, invalidated you, or made you feel responsible for their emotions, it is completely understandable to want some kind of justice. You may imagine the day they finally realize what they lost. You may want them to recognize how much you gave, how much you tolerated, and how much their behavior hurt you. Those feelings are human. But if your healing depends on their regret, you remain emotionally connected to the very person you are trying to move beyond. Your life can look completely different on the outside while your mind is still waiting for their reaction. You may have stopped contacting them, yet you continue checking their social media, wondering who they are with, asking mutual friends what they are saying, or imagining whether they miss you. That is still a form of emotional attachment, because their behavior continues to determine where your attention goes. The goal is not to become indifferent to everything you experienced. The goal is to become less dependent on the other person's response for your sense of peace. You can acknowledge that what happened hurt you without requiring them to admit it. You can accept that they may never understand your experience in the way you wish they would. You can recognize that someone may tell a completely different story about the relationship and still know what you personally experienced. This is difficult because human beings naturally seek validation, especially after being repeatedly questioned or dismissed. When someone has spent a long time telling you that you are too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding, or somehow responsible for every problem, you may begin to doubt your own perception. That is why healing involves rebuilding trust in yourself. You begin asking, what did I observe? How did I feel consistently? What patterns kept repeating? What boundaries did I communicate? What happened when I communicated them? These questions are more useful than endlessly trying to decode the other person's motives. Emotional freedom also means understanding that you do not need revenge to establish justice in your own life. You do not need to hurt someone because they hurt you. You do not need to become emotionally unavailable to everyone. Because one relationship taught you to distrust closeness. You do not need to prove that you are happier without them. Your healing does not have to be a performance. You can quietly rebuild your life without announcing every step. You can become healthier, more confident, more peaceful, and more selective without doing any of it for an audience. In fact, some of the most meaningful healing happens when nobody else knows about it. You begin sleeping better. You begin making decisions without imagining their reaction. You start enjoying things that have nothing to do with the relationship. You reconnect with friends. You establish routines. You rediscover interests that disappeared while you were consumed by conflict. Slowly, your identity becomes larger than the role you played in that relationship. You also learn that boundaries are not punishments. A boundary does not say, I will make you suffer because you hurt me. A boundary says, this is what I will and will not participate in. That difference is essential. If you decide not to respond to insults, that is a boundary. If you decide to end conversations when they become disrespectful, that is a boundary. If you decide that you will not continue a relationship where trust has repeatedly been broken, that is a boundary. You do not need to convince another person that your boundary is reasonable before you are allowed to have it. Other people are allowed to disagree with your boundaries. They are not entitled to override them. There may still be moments when you miss the person. That does not mean you made the wrong decision. Missing someone is not the same as needing them back. You can miss the good memories while remembering why the relationship became unhealthy. You can feel compassion for someone's struggles without volunteering to become responsible for them. You can recognize their positive qualities without denying the harmful patterns that affected you. Healing is rarely a straight line. Some days you may feel strong, and other days a memory, photograph, song, or unexpected message may bring everything back for a moment. Instead of judging yourself, remind yourself that emotions are temporary experiences. You do not have to turn every emotion into an action. Eventually, you may notice something remarkable. The questions that once consumed you begin to lose their power. You stop wondering whether they are watching you. You stop needing to know whether they regret losing you. You stop analyzing every social media post for hidden messages. You stop asking whether they are happier with someone else. You stop trying to predict whether they will come back. The silence becomes less frightening because your life has become fuller. Their absence is no longer an empty space that you need them to fill. It becomes simply an absence. And that is when you begin to understand that the greatest victory was never getting the final word. It was getting your attention back. So if someone reacts strongly after you stop caring, remember that their reaction does not define your responsibility. You can observe it without being pulled into it. You can allow them to have their emotions without making those emotions your emergency. You can maintain compassion without sacrificing your boundaries. You can walk away without needing to convince anyone that you were right. And you can choose peace even when the other person chooses conflict. The most powerful thing you can do is not become better at playing the same emotional game. It is to leave the game entirely. When your decisions are based on your values rather than their reactions, when your boundaries remain firm even when guilt appears, and when your future becomes more important than their opinion of you, something fundamental changes. You are no longer trying to win against them. You are simply choosing yourself. And that is not revenge. That is recovery. That is emotional maturity. That is the moment when another person's ability to disturb your peace begins to shrink, because you finally understand that your life does not need their apology, their approval, their regret, or their suffering in order for you to move forward.